What if the most terrifying thing about the Holocaust was not the hatred? What if it was the paperwork, the schedules, the accounting, the filing systems, the freight allocations, the terrifying possibility that modern civilization did not collapse into chaos, but functioned exactly as designed? Welcome back to ORSUS. This is ENDLÖSUNG, and this is not a story about monsters. It is a story about systems. For a very long time, I knew that ORSUS Book Six had to exist. I also knew it could not be approached carelessly, because the moment you enter this historical territory, you immediately face a serious problem. The Second World War, and particularly the Holocaust, has become so mythologized in popular culture that many stories now unconsciously drift towards spectacle. The uniforms, the villains, the iconography. Cinema has conditioned us to look at these events through highly emotional visual shorthand. But the deeper I researched the period, the more I realised something profoundly unsettling. The real horror was not irrationality. It was rationality. It was procedure. It was administration. The people operating many parts of the system were not standing in rooms screaming ideology all day. They were processing forms, managing freight, approving invoices, tracking inventory, balancing insurance exposure. And that became the central thematic foundation of Endlösung. Section 1. The Raw and the Mundane. One of the most important structural decisions I made in this book involved consolidation. Originally, Endlösung had roughly 50 chapters, large sections focused individually on freight logistics, liquidation protocols, railway scheduling, banking conversion systems, procurement architecture, industrial chemistry, post-war asset migration, insurance frameworks, agricultural recycling contracts, and bureaucratic fragmentation. But eventually I realized something. Splitting those systems into too many separate narrative fragments actually weakened the psychological effect, because the true horror lies in accumulation, not in one ledger, not in one form, not in one transport schedule, but the overwhelming administrative mass of it all. So I began collapsing major sections together. Liquidation accounting became the gravitational center. Everything began orbiting that chapter, because that is where civilization effectively loses its soul. Not in the speeches, not even necessarily in the camps themselves, but in the moment human suffering becomes measurable, auditable, process-driven, economically integrated, and statistically manageable. And I think that that was the correct structural decision, because the chapter stops feeling like content. It begins feeling like pressure, like suffocation. The reader slowly realizes this wasn't chaos, this was infrastructure. Section 2. Why Martin Bormann mattered. Another major breakthrough for me involved Bosartik. For years I understood the consistory philosophically, but I had not yet fully identified the correct 20th century vestiture. Then I returned to Martin Bormann, and suddenly everything aligned, because Bormann is frequently misunderstood historically. People tend to focus on Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, Goebbels, but Bormann was something colder. He was administrative continuity. He understood the files, the jurisdiction, the party access, the asset routing, the institutional survival. He wasn't merely ideological, he was infrastructural. And that made him perfect for Ursus, because Endlösung is not truly about Nazism as a political movement. It is about scalable administrative systems detached from morality. Nazism becomes one deployment environment, one extraordinarily successful deployment environment, sadly. But the deeper question is, what happens when institutions begin prioritizing their own continuity above human consequences? And that is the machine. Section 3. The Mauermann File. One of my favourite sequences in the book involves Max Mauermann. He was an Austrian engineer. A legal battle, a patent dispute, and on the surface it appears mundane, but that is precisely why it matters, because it demonstrates something horrifyingly durable. Institutions can survive moral defeat. Individuals may die, governments may collapse, executives may disappear, but the systems persist. The consistory in Ursus understands this better than anyone, and so their true objective is never domination in the theatrical sense. It is continuity, preservation, migration, adaptation. The machine does not require ideological purity, it requires survival. And that becomes the central operating philosophy behind Endlösung. Section 4. Why did the book need real testimony? This book could never function responsibly without grounding itself in real human testimony, and that matters enormous to me, which is why figures like Primo Levi, Gita Sereni, Hannah Arendt, Vlad Kamid, and Zalman Gladowski become structurally important. They're not decorative, they're foundational. The historical voices anchor the fiction. They stop the narrative drifting towards abstraction, because ultimately this cannot become merely an intellectual exercise. Behind every ledger and transport schedule were human beings, families, children, communities, lives reduced to an inventory. The resistance couriers especially affected me during the research. Young women moving through occupied Warsaw, carrying intelligence, forged documents, weapons, and eyewitness accounts hidden inside shoes and clothing. They weren't superheroes, not action film protagonists. They were human beings operating under incredible pressure. And perhaps the most extraordinary thing of all, many of them understood that documentation itself was a resistance. Writing became resistance. Memory was resistance. Witnessing became resistance, and that idea sits at the centre of Endlösung. Section 5. The machine today. One thing I want to make very clear, Endlösung is not arguing that modern society is becoming like Nazi Germany. That is neither intellectually serious nor historically responsible, but the book absolutely is asking readers to examine recurring institutional behaviours, because history really repeats literally, but systems do recur. The language changes, the uniforms change, the banners change, the mechanisms often remain disturbingly familiar. It's information control, administrative abstraction, distributed responsibility, economic dehumanization, institutional self-preservation, and those patterns matter. And perhaps the most dangerous thing modern societies can do is assume that they are permanently immune to them. That assumption itself is historically catastrophic. Endlösung is probably the most difficult book I have written, but perhaps the most important, because it forced me to stop looking only at the villains and started looking directly at the systems. Not how monsters behaved, but how civilization organized itself so monsters could operate efficiently. The machine never truly disappears. It only waits for people to stop paying attention. I'm Di-Fanteria, and this is ORSUS.